Today I'm going to talk about Aperture, what it is, what it's used for, and the effect that it will have on the pictures that we take. Now, first of all, what it is. You should now be seeing a picture of me upside down in this lens, and the circle defining that image is the aperture of this lens. This is a very wide lens, and last seen it was set to around 1.4, which is a very wide aperture. So this lens would deliver me at this setting a very narrow depth of field. Aperture is measured in f-stops. A low number, for example f1.4, will give us a very shallow depth of field. A high number, for example f22, gives us a much deeper depth of field. In landscape photography, I tend to stop increasing my aperture around about f16, because after f16 we begin to introduce something called diffraction, which makes the picture soft, which is somehow defeating the object of increasing the aperture. We want our pictures to be sharp. So most photographers think of aperture in terms of shallow or deep depths of field, as I've just mentioned myself. But it's much more than that. A wider aperture will allow more light into the sensor, and when we allow more light into the sensor, the default is that the picture becomes brighter. And this is where you start to deal with what's called the Triumvirate of Settings: aperture, ISO, and shutter speed. And so far as this video is concerned, where we introduce more light with changing the aperture setting, we will probably need to compensate for that by decreasing the amount of light we're allowing in with either the shutter speed or with the ISO. While I think of it, now would be a great time to go down below the video and put a like on the video. Even better, subscribe to the channel. It's great for me, helps the YouTube algorithm and makes sure that these videos are seen more widely. What could be better? I'd really appreciate it, but let's get on with the video. So here's a picture I've taken. Now this is a canyon in the Badlands north of Granada, and the challenge in this picture was to get detail into the picture. It needed to be really sharp, because this picture really is all about texture, and I needed it to be in sharp focus around about this area. So there's quite a lot of distance in the picture, but I'm not particularly concerned about what's going on in the background, because it's more or less the same as what's going on in the foreground. These canyons just go back into the distance. So the aperture I chose was 7.1, and this will deliver me sharpness, and it will do the job and so far as the aesthetic quality of the picture is concerned. So that's one illustration of depth of field. Now, what do I mean by depth of field? Depth of field measures the area that is in acceptably sharp focus in any given picture. So depth of field lies somewhere between the camera and the horizon. Now, a couple of things come into play in this. One is the distance of the camera from the subject. The other is the distance of the horizon, and the third thing is the aperture. Now, the conventional wisdom is that the higher the aperture number, the deeper the depth of field. But as landscape photographers, we want to achieve focus, or acceptably sharp focus, in the area that's important in the picture. And often in landscape photography, that will go front to back. Now, there are different types of photograph, and your focal point, the thing on which you are focusing, or the subject of the picture, might be closer to the camera than it was in this picture that I've just been talking about. So there are different things that come into play, and is a good idea to have a look at the depth of field tables to work out for any given lens what these values actually are. A 200mm lens focusing on something 100 meters away will deliver sharpness at f16 from a distance of 46 meters from the camera, roughly to infinity. Now, that's a great thing for a photograph such as the one that I just showed you, where you may want everything to be in focus. Not such a great thing, though, if I've got something that is less than 46 meters away in the frame. Now, this is where you need to understand that depth of field is effectively a window of sharp focus, and by manipulating aperture and the distance away from the thing that we're focusing at, we can use this to our very great advantage. Same lens focusing on the same subject at an aperture of f4 will deliver sharpness from a distance of 77 meters to 143 meters. Now, this is a very big difference. So a lot depends in this case on where you're actually pointing the camera, and is the angle of the camera straight ahead or is it pointing down? In this picture, which was shot with an aperture of 7.1, the requirement was different. If I'd shot straight ahead, I would be showing much more headroom at the top of the picture, but actually the camera is pointing down at the foreground. So this area here was only a matter of a couple of meters away from the camera, so I elected to use a much wider aperture in order to capture that sharply. And I wasn't quite so bothered about the area at the top of the frame, because really that's not the story of the picture. The story of the picture is the stream tumbling down the hill towards the camera. Okay, we've looked at two very different pictures here, and what I've done is to use the aperture in combination with the distance of the subject or the focal point from the camera in order to change the aesthetic of the shot. We've got tables, and there's a pointer up above which will give you a link to where these tables are on my website, and I'd advise having a look at those so that you can understand in detail the effect of aperture and distance on pictures with different lenses. To put your mind at rest, you don't have to memorize the tables, and you don't have to get your slide rule and a laser pointer out. The reality is, when we're out in the field, we cannot estimate these distances exactly. I can say that's a couple of meters from me, or that's roughly 50 meters from me, but I can't say with any certainty whether it's 23.2 meters or 27.1 meter. And actually it's immaterial, because there are some very helpful rules of thumb which allow us to circumnavigate the detail. First one is probably the most well known, and is probably the least accurate, to be perfectly honest, but it's the rule that says if I focus using middle range apertures, i.e. apertures between f7 and f16, if I focus a third of the way into the picture, then the majority of that picture is going to be sharp front to back. And this holds reasonably true over pictures that are not involving massive distances and not involving very close-up objects. So if I'm taking a picture of a vegetable garden, for example, that's a perfectly good rule of thumb to use. It will give you sharp focus front to back using those mid-range apertures. Now, for bigger landscape shots, there's another rule of thumb which is much more accurate, and this is called double the distance. And what this rule is based upon is the concept of hyperfocal distance. Now, what hyperfocal distance is the distance between the lens and the nearest object that you need to be in sharp focus. And there are some very precise tables which will calculate your hyperfocal distance. And the good news is we don't need to use these, we just need to understand them. Double the distance says that if I focus at roughly double the distance of the nearest object that I want to be in focus, then that object will be in focus and so will the horizon. And this holds especially true for landscape photographs that involve great distances. Now, the big exception to this rule is where we use wide-angle lenses. Wide-angle lenses and macro lenses, in fact, have completely different characteristics. So neither of these rules will hold true for those cases. Now, with wide-angle lenses, they're very popular in landscape photography because you can get the whole vista in shot. But the downside of wide-angle lenses is that although they will give you a deep depth of field, they will also reduce the size of the things that are in the distance, preferring to exaggerate the size of the things that are in the foreground. So probably the more creative use of wide-angle lenses in landscape photography is to turn the camera into portrait mode and get your near distance in sharp focus whilst showing you that and leading you into the picture, with your distant objects being relatively small in the background. And there are numerous examples of this kind of shooting. Here's one of them. In this picture, we've got a distance of probably 1 meter between the camera and these rocks. And we've got this area in the background, which is in reasonably sharp focus, and the distance is nearly 1 mile, I would guess. The setting in this picture is actually f9, and this gives me sharpness front to back in this particular circumstance. The other rule of thumb, and this contradicts everything that I've said so far, is actually focus on the subject, and there is one particular photograph where you absolutely have to do this. Let's have a look at that case. Okay, this photograph was taken at a distance of probably around about 1 mile from the lens. You'll see that we've got pretty extraordinary detail on the ski station in there. And I took this picture using a tripod. We focused exactly on this area here. And there is no other way I could have done this because the whole vista in the picture is so far away. So there is nothing in this picture that would make the slightest bit of difference had I focused on it. So if I'd focused on the foreground, we're really only focusing about 200 meters closer. And with a distance of 1 mile, it would be too great a risk to take to try to calculate my foreground and background distance. On pictures where you're actually looking at a very great distance and there is no discernible foreground or middle ground, absolutely focus on the thing that is important in the shot. And this one was all about getting the ski station in shot. And as a happy coincidence, the rules that I've already described determines that I actually get this area here in sharp focus as well. So this is the radio mast and this is an observatory. And these three things are separated by quite a large distance, probably 1/4 mile, and all three of them are in shot as a result of me focusing on the one in the front. So that's your third rule of thumb. Now there are some circumstances where none of these rules will work, and in those circumstances the only choice you have is to do something called focus stacking. And focus stacking is something which is going to be the subject of a completely different video, and we're going to go into it in detail, but in essence the art of focus stacking is to overlap and combine the depths of field from different photographs. So if I have a photograph that gives me something in the foreground, something in the middle ground, and something in the background, and I can't get them all in one shot, then what I need to do is take a shot that's focusing on the background and a shot that's focusing on the foreground. And for 9 photographs out of 10, the depths of field of those two shots will overlap. But what I always do is take a middle ground shot as well, just in case I don't get those depths of fields in those two shots to overlap. So I've got a safety shot. And if I'm using Lightroom and Photoshop, or if I'm using Affinity Photo, I can merge those photographs to make the best of all of the areas of sharp focus. So that would give me completely sharp focus from probably a meter in front of the lens all the way to the horizon. And that's something we're going to cover in a different video. So I hope this video has been useful. I hope it's shed some light on the vexatious subject of aperture. We're going to do a separate video that will cover the triumvirate of aperture, ISO and shutter speed, so that we can see in detail how balancing these 3 settings will give us various shades of perfect exposure. So hope it's been useful, and we'll see you in the next video. Thanks a lot for watching, guys.